Hello everyone, happy Wednesday and welcome to week 2 of our class, Aesthetics and Theory of Communication. Before I do get started with this week's presentation, I want to apologize again for last week's class. I always hate to miss the first week's class meeting because that's my time to get to know everyone and introduce the class. So it's really unfortunate that the technical difficulties should occur, but we are moving along pretty well. As far as announcements for the course, I have provided feedback on the week 1 analysis activity, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And I've also graded the week 2 exploration at this point too. So be sure to take a look at my feedback. Even though you get a 100 on that assignment, I do provide input on what you wrote and try to point out any observations that I want to make sure that you notice, and also clarify any points that I think might be misunderstood or any problems that I see. So be sure to look at the feedback on all the exploration activities, because that information could definitely help you out as you move into the analysis. And if there are any questions, as always, be sure to get in touch either by phone, by email, or through FSO's messaging. One thing I like to do in each week's go-to session is to look back at the previous week's analysis and talk about some of the observations that you had, and also point out some things that I want to make sure everyone in the class takes notice of. And so last week's analysis was on the emotional design aspects of the Chipotle Scarecrow video. This is essentially a commercial, but it also takes the form of a short film, a short animated film. And we were looking at this in order to discern how visceral, behavioral, and reflective emotion played a part in the video's storyline and imagery. Starting at the most basic level of emotion, which is visceral, we would look at things that evoke instinctive reactions in us as the viewers, or kind of connect with us on a very fundamental emotional level. Some of the things, I think everybody mentioned the use of color, which is a very valid factor at this level of emotion. Also the use of the music. Color is something that we're going to talk about this week, actually, but is also relevant when talking about emotional design. In the early parts of the video, you see the colors are all very muted. It looks very overcast and dusty and just generally very forlorn and sad. And that really ties in with the overall mood that we see depicted or demonstrated by the Scarecrow himself, as well as the other characters. And then later in the video, we see this red pepper amongst all of the green of the garden, and everything becomes vibrant. And it's at that point that the tone of the entire storyline changes and becomes more hopeful, becomes more upbeat, and just all around more positive. So the color really kind of underscores those moods. It's sort of a very subtle prompt for us to kind of follow along with the moods of the story. And the music does this as well, and it's something that musical scores have done for years. You will see that they make use of music to create mood, and it goes along with what's being shown in the scene. One thing that's important to point out, though, is when it comes to music, it's all about, and when we're talking about music at the visceral level, it's really all about the tone of the music. So it's that minor key that's very low and sort of melancholy, and then it picks up, it goes up to a higher key when it becomes more hopeful. When we start getting into things like the lyrics and the meanings of the lyrics, that's a much higher level of emotion. That's more of a reflective level factor, because visceral level doesn't require us to think about anything. It doesn't require us to interpret anything. We just feel it. Some of the really important visceral qualities that I wanted to point out, though, are the use of facial expressions. Because remember, our sense of empathy is an important factor at that instinctive level of emotion. And so by demonstrating these emotions through the scarecrow and through the sad cow and the other people around, we mirror that. As the viewers see that, and we'll reflect it back through our natural sense of empathy as human beings. And that's something that filmmakers, advertisers, marketers, and what have you have long taken advantage of in order to create an emotional connection with the viewers. And actually, this brings up an important point. When we talk about these emotional factors, we're talking about how this communicates to the viewer. Not necessarily in between these characters in the storyline. That's not important. What's important is what this communicates to your audience. And that becomes a factor with the behavioral aspect of this video. Behavioral design, if you'll remember, is very practical. It's like, what does this benefit me right now? What is my immediate benefit? Or what does this mean to me? What's in it for me? And this is a commercial for Chipotle, and while it doesn't come right out and say, hey, buy Chipotle's foods, it's better for you, it's better for the environment, there isn't a blatant statement of that, but it's implied through the entire storyline. We see these factory-produced foods that are 100% beefish, and we see it come out of these vats of stuff, and all the inhumane treatment of the animals that it depicts, and just is generally unappetizing. It's very mechanical and impersonal. And then this is contrasted with the bright colors, the more happy expressions, the even just the green of the garden that just looks more wholesome. And there's that personal connection where the scarecrow is making it by hand. So all of these things tell us that this is just an all-around better product, or the more desirable option for us. And so it takes a little bit of interpretation to really work that out in the video, but that is really the main behavioral level aspect. And finally, a reflective level is really the highest level from an emotional standpoint. This is big picture stuff, our connection with the world, our connection with each other, kind of quality of life, social status, and so forth. And if we look at the video, we have, there's a lot of symbolism, like the crow that's bossing around the scarecrow, so it's a reversal of the roles. But then later in the video, he shoos away the crow and kind of takes charge of his own life and makes this decision to do things differently because he's completely disillusioned with the state of society. And so we see that message, that story of how one person can make a difference, one person can choose to do things differently. And then in the end, there's that banner that says "Cultivate a Better World." So it's sort of a call to action to us to follow in his footsteps, follow his example rather, and make the world a better place. So it's sort of the hero's journey kind of story that we're witnessing. And that's very, very much reflective in nature because it makes us think about what are the consequences of our choices, what can we do as individuals to make things better, and so forth. So that is basically the overview of emotional design. It was a bit of a complex example to kind of pick apart, but really good examples of these various aspects of emotion inherent in media creation. And really my purpose was to get you thinking about how you might make an emotional connection with your audience. There are various ways. And what we see with the scarecrow video is that these different levels of emotion and different types of emotion really can work together to create an overall stronger message. That they don't really operate in isolation typically, but you can leverage all of these different emotional connections to really drive home your point or your message. So as you do these analysis activities, really keep in mind that these are the big activities for the course. These are 20-point assignments, and you really want to put a lot of time into them. You want to be sure you're thorough in documenting your observations, explain exactly what you're thinking and what you're seeing in each of the examples that we analyze. Okay, so this week's material, going back to our layers of aesthetics, where emotional design was all about the associations layer, why it matters to your beholder. This week we're going to talk about color in terms of the associations. Again, what does it matter to the audience, and also at the form layer of aesthetics is simply how it is presented. We're going to talk about color from the standpoint of color theory as well as color psychology. This is actually two different topics. Color theory is a formal practice of using color to create a particular appearance. This is the study of how colors interact with one another. Color psychology is about what colors mean to the viewer. And this could be from either an instinctive standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, or from a societal standpoint, cultural standpoint. So I'm going to flash some movie posters. These are actually fake movie posters that were created for the movie Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, but they're really good examples of the use of color in various contexts. And as I flash these on the screen, I want you to look at how color is used and think about how that use of color suits the themes and style of the poster. And here's one for a film called Action Doctor. And notice where your eye is immediately drawn in this case. What is the immediate focal point? Here's one that looks like a bit more of a romantic drama. And one that looks like it might be a little bit more suspenseful. So let me back up. With this first example, you have what appears to be an action film, and of course it's called Action Doctor. So it's pretty easy to guess that this is probably an action movie. And they make use of this highly contrasting warm and cool colors. The blue backdrop with this splash of orange fire, like an explosion. And by contrasting that color, they create this focal point. They make this figure and the explosion around him stand out. And that's a really common way of drawing attention to a particular area, but also creating a sense of excitement and of action. Here, there's very little contrast as far as color. These are all mainly warm colors, so very close, very similar to one another, and it creates a very warm feeling that kind of goes along with this idea of a romantic film. And then finally, there's the achromatic. Achromatic meaning no color. It's colorless. But they've thrown in this accent color. for the title, You Just Don't Exist. And they use red, which is a very dramatic color in itself. It's often associated with danger and threats of harm or strong emotion. And so it also creates a focal point, but also creates this very dramatic mood. So these are a few examples that I wanted to use to set the stage for today's topic, because these encompass both color theory and color psychology. They make use of the color contrasts or color harmonies to create a particular appearance, but also use specific colors to create meaning. Let's start off our talk with color theory. You may have seen the color wheel before if you've ever taken an art class. And the color wheel is a very fundamental tool for artists dealing with color theory. The colors on the color wheel are arranged in a way that that demonstrates the color relationships. Colors that are similar to each other are immediately adjacent to one another, and the colors that are opposite on the color wheel are colors that have the highest possible contrast with one another. And in the readings, textbook readings for this week, there's a mention of how this is arranged in a way that is actually based on our optic nerves, on how our eyeballs work, because these opposite colors compete for our color receptors in our eye. And so that contrast that you see is caused by them competing for attention, basically, for in very simplified terms. And that'll become important when we start selecting what colors to use in order to create a particular mood or vibe or feel. Just some quick terminology. Any color, any pure color is called a color hue. So this could be red or orange red or teal or blue or violet. Those are pure hues. The word tint, T-I-N-T, refers to a lighter variety or brighter variety of that color. So if you were working with paints and you mixed white with red, you would have pink, which is actually a tint of red. And then a shade is the opposite of a tint. That is darker varieties of a color. So if you were to mix paints and you mixed in a drop of black paint with orange, you would have a darker orange, maybe moving towards a brown, but that would be a shade of orange. So it's these terms, when you hear me use these terms, hue or tint or shade, you'll know what those refer to. Sometimes we use these interchangeably, but there's really specific meanings to what a tint is and a shade, as well as a color hue. And I'll also refer to warm and cool colors. Warm colors are those that are associated with feelings of warmth or with fire. And these are reds, orange, yellow, even into the yellow greens. But in any of those colors that are more into that half of the color wheel that calls to mind heat. You think about when you turn on your stovetop, the elements begin to turn red as they grow hotter. Cool colors are those that call to mind feelings of coolness or cold, maybe those that would give the impression of water or ice, the blues, the violets, green, especially the greens as they move towards the blue hues. And this contrast between warm and cool colors is also very important because these are the colors that will give you the best contrast and the most dramatic and dynamic contrast. Warm colors, from a visual standpoint, tend to appear to pop forward towards your viewer. and give a sense of action and excitement. Think back to the Action Doctor poster I just showed. That little splash of orange would tend to pop forward, whereas the blue tends to recede into the backdrop. And that's what cool colors do. They tend to appear to recede away from the viewer, creating an impression of distance. And they're also more calm and subdued, whereas the warm colors are more action-oriented. A lot of times the visual impression of color will depend on the context. As even with warm colors, you can have a little bit more subdued feel if the image itself calls to mind that feeling. When you have colors that are close to each other on the color wheel, there tends to be a kind of a harmony to them. There's not that dramatic contrast, so it feels a little more well, harmonious and subdued. And this is what we have here. This color arrangement is called analogous. Because the colors are similar to one another, they're analogous to one another. But if you want to create something more dynamic, more exciting, you would select colors that are farther apart on the color wheel, with the most extreme being those that are direct opposites, and those are called complementary colors. Make note of that word, because complementary is often misinterpreted as meaning simply that they work well together, or they're somehow simply visually appealing together. But what it really means is that they are opposites on the color wheel, and they have the strongest possible contrast with one another. And that's what we have here in this image, which has the teal of the ocean scene that is really sharply accented with this bright orange. And again, that creates a focal point. Any contrast of that sort will draw the viewer's eye. So we have that focal point created by the coral, which is actually a melted candle. It's sort of an artistic visual illusion. These two ideas of analogous and complementary colors really is the basis for color theory as a whole. If you can understand that idea that colors that are farther apart on the color wheel have higher contrast and they are complementary, while those that are close together have harmony, lower contrast, and so usually a bit lower energy as well, then you can, from there, you can really put together all of the other color schemes and kind of predict how they will appear on the page. The most basic color scheme is the monochromatic. And just to be clear what monochromatic means, we can kind of take apart this word, mono, which means one, and chromatic means color. Chroma is color. So that means a single color. That means your entire piece of media only uses one color. Now it might use tints and shades of that color, so you have some variety, but it's still only that color. Maybe it's monochromatic blue. No other colors appear. Analogous can appear similar to monochromatic, but has a little bit more variety in the colors. So you might have yellow, orange, and this is actually yellow, orange, and yellow-orange, the color in between the two. The monochromatic color palette tends to be very clean and elegant, calm, and very calm. Actually, it can be calm or energizing depending on if it's monochromatic cool color like blue or monochromatic warm color like orange or red. Analogous colors have a similar energy and appearance, but just more richness and more variety in the colors, since you're including 2 or 3 different colors. Here's an example. This is a monochromatic painting. Notice that only blue is used in this painting. This is by Pablo Picasso. Since he's using tints, very light tints of blue to create the highlights and shades of blue to create the shadows, there's still a sense of form and shape, but no other colors are used. Where an analogous color palette gives a little bit more variety, so you can create a little bit more interesting compositions, like this painting, which is actually by Claude Monet. Here's a more modern example. This is a monochromatic design for a movie poster. Again, only using tints and shades of blue. And some warm colors. This is probably monochromatic as well. It gets a little hard to tell if it's strictly monochromatic or analogous. It could be orange and yellow, or just tints and shades of yellow, but a very limited color in the warm region of the color wheel. Notice that they are using dark, like black shadows in both cases to create more of a dramatic appearance, because black is achromatic. It doesn't really count as far as the color scheme goes. So you can make use of shadows to create more dramatic impressions. And we already saw this travel advertisement with analogous warm colors going from yellow to orange, red, and kind of leaning towards the violet range, more of a magenta there. These are all on the warm side of the spectrum. And even in web design, this is taken into account. This is basically an analogous color palette with greens, blue, and blues that allow us to create some color variety for use in the navigation buttons and so forth. Still very elegant, very harmonious feeling. And they have this accent with the pencil and the thumbtack that stick out, but for the most part the colors are limited to the cool color region. So the other side of the coin is the complementary colors. And now you get this really high contrast. The blue and orange contrast is a very common color palette used in a lot of movie posters, especially because of the dramatic appearance it can have. It really takes advantage of that warm versus cool color contrast and creates something that's very dynamic and exciting. Like we see here with Iron Man. The cool blue backdrop really just gives us something for the warm explosions and the warm colors of Iron Man's armor to act upon. And remember how that warm color pops forward towards the viewer, so those warm colors will cause Iron Man to really appear to fly towards us. Kind of a 3D effect without having to resort to 3D. And it's just an overall exciting feel. I mean, beyond the fact that there's explosions everywhere and Iron Man is firing his repulsor beams. It just really accents that feeling of excitement and action. And these colors can also help to underscore moods, like we talked about with the Scarecrow video. And this movie poster demonstrates that. You can see Jason Bateman up here on the top half struggling with these babies, and he's obviously troubled and not a happy look on his face, and that's associated with the cool color, with the blue, which is again a more of a subdued mood and goes right along with that theme. Whereas Ryan Reynolds down here in the lower half is obviously demonstrated much more positive mood with the young women, and is associated with the more the brighter and warmer and more exciting orange. And that's starting to get into the region of color psychology, so we'll revisit this a little later. And I mentioned that complementary colors can be used to establish focal points, and that's what you see used a lot in movies. This is a scene from Harry Potter. I'm not sure which movie this is from, but notice Harry Potter's Gryffindor robes are red, and the entire scenery is green, which is the complement to red if you look at the color wheel, which means that Harry Potter is going to stand out pretty strongly against that backdrop. He's going to remain our focal point. And that was certainly planned. That was not an accident. So it keeps our attention on Harry as he's flying in the Quidditch match. And even Malfoy's Slytherin robes, which are green, tend to fade into the backdrop a bit, so that while he's significant in the scene, it's Harry Potter that's keeping our attention. And we saw another example of this in the Scarecrow video with the red pepper that stands in contrast with the complementary green. Again, red and green are complements. So really keeps our attention on that pepper and underscores its significance. And this idea is used in surprising places that you may not have noticed, but hopefully you will now. For example, if you look at a newscast, almost always there will be a blue backdrop. And sometimes it'll look like that's due to some kind of screen. There's like monitors in the background and something of that nature. But what's happening is that they are keeping our attention on their anchors, on the talking heads, because pretty much universally our skin tones are in the warm color region. And so that contrast with the cool blue backdrop will make sure that that person stands out very strongly, and that it keeps our attention focused where it needs to be. So really the analogous versus complementary color schemes are at the heart of what we're talking about. If you get that idea down, then you really have the gist of color theory. But this allows for more complex color schemes like split complementary, which basically just means that instead of taking colors that are directly opposite, you're taking a color and then the two colors that are right next to its opposite. So in this case we have teal, which is sort of a blue-green, paired with red and orange, the two colors that are analogous to its opposite. And this has an effect very similar to a normal complementary color pair, but just allows you to have more variety in your colors, greater color richness. Think about the website we looked at earlier that had the blues and greens, and now you have some warm colors thrown into the mix, and it creates a bit more of an upbeat and more exciting appearance, which is appropriate because this website is actually much more lighthearted in its approach. The other one was a more serious architecture firm, and this one is a web design service that takes a very tongue-in-cheek approach. Look at the slogans, great websites, no lame marketing slogans, and seriously these days everyone and their mom has a website, so obviously they want to add a little bit of humor into their presentation, and that exciting contrast goes right along with that. And as we continue to add more and more color into our color palette, then we get into setups like the tetradic color scheme. And this is just 2 sets of complementary colors. So 4 colors altogether in this case, with teal and orange again, and violet, and this is a little bit more of a yellow-green, so not quite a true complementary color palette, but pretty close. You get that same color contrast, and that's what matters. This, with a tetradic, you have a lot of color contrast, so it's already pretty vibrant, and then just loads of different colors. So it's very exciting, very colorful, can be very quirky, and generally pretty exciting to look at. And here's a well-known example that you have the purple and yellow complements, the red and green very strongly represented, and with the green being so prominent in the background, Willy Wonka's magenta coat really stands out. So he's kind of put in very stark, prominent positions. Nearly the same color scheme now used on PBS Kids' website. So you see that the amount of color richness that's inherent in this color scheme really can appeal to children's media, things that are more fun and more playful. So we've looked at analogous, we've looked at complementary, split complementary, and tetradic. And so these are all color schemes that make use of the idea of colors are either similar to one another or they're very different from one another. And we can pick them to create a particular impression. What if they are evenly spread around the color wheel? And that's what triadic color palettes make use of. This is 3 colors that are equidistant. So notice that this is different from split complementary, because in split complementary there are more opposites, whereas these are exactly even in their distance from one another. And so what would that create if you think about the idea that colors that are closer are more similar, colors that are farther apart are more contrasting and more different. If they're evenly spread, that means there's a balance, that it's kind of the balance between harmony and contrast is dead even. So we don't want the kind of action-oriented complementary color palette, but we also don't want it to be very sedate and very subdued like we would give an analogous, so this is that middle ground. And the example here is the Rosie the Riveter poster from World War II with red, yellow, and blue as the prominent colors. And there's our modern equivalent with a similar color palette, and that's the X-Men from Marvel Comics. This is one of the least frequently used color palettes, so you really rarely see it, but if you need something that's just kind of a middle ground as far as excitement and elegance, then this could do well. One last thing on the topic of color theory that I want to show is just how often this is used. It's not just in visual media. As we saw in the news examples, that it's taken into account in live news broadcasts, but also this applies to any visual media, including fashion design. I don't know how timely these images are. Some of them look pretty dated, but just looking at the colors, you see that the same rules apply. Monochromatic color palettes with single color outfits. Analogous colors with similar colors, yellow, orange, and kind of a red-orange, or orange-red. and other warm colors and other cool color combinations. And complementary, where you have the opposites. There's that orange and blue combination again, red and green, which we saw in earlier examples, and more of the purple and yellow, and split complementary as well. So look for these. Start looking at the media that you encounter, and look for how these complementary or analogous colors are made use of. And I mentioned achromatic earlier, and this is another option that you have available. If you want to avoid using color, you can go for grayscale or black and white. Achromatic does mean no color. It's colorless, and so this would be pure values, black and white, and various grayscale in between. Using achromatic imagery tends to have a lower energy than you would if you included color, because you really can't take advantage of the color contrasts like you could with the other color palettes. And so it tends to be a depressed mood. It can be very serious in appearance, or very, very gritty. Although it can also be elegant depending on the content as well. This is an illustration by M.C. Escher, done in, I believe, pen and ink. But looking at some more modern media examples, this is a James Bond movie poster, very serious look. That would probably suit the very serious themes of the movie. This is one from the Exploration, and I can't remember who posted this one, but this is an example of what's called an accented achromatic. And what we have is something that's mostly colorless, but then they throw in a splash of color to get our attention. And that is happening with this alien egg that's cracking, and this bright neon green is kind of oozing out. And it, like we saw earlier, that creates a focal point. It draws our eye to that point. There's a little bit more color here. There's sort of a fine line between what constitutes an accented achromatic and what creates a monochromatic color palette. This one is a little more into the achromatic, since it's mostly black and white and gray. There's a scene from the movie Schindler's List that again uses that accent color on an otherwise achromatic scene, and a modern day advertisement as well. So you see how using that accent color can establish those focal points, draws the eye to a specific location, also can create a mood, or use a color to create, imbue emotion. And this to show a variety of media types. Here's a web design using an accented achromatic as well. And let me know if you do have any questions on the topic of color theory. Be sure to read through the content focus, as there's more to this that is covered in those readings. And so I had mentioned a few times the idea of color creating a mood, or color having specific emotions connected with it. And that's when we get into color psychology. Color psychology includes things like the culture we live in, because just living our lives in the culture that we are raised in results in us having certain associations with colors. If we look at the colors that I have on the screen, green and red, together, what comes to mind? There are a couple of answers that I always get. First of all is perhaps stop and go. And we come to recognize these based on traffic signals. There might be yellow in here as well, but especially stop and go. And stop is always red and go is always green. So we don't even have to see the words to know that meaning. Also, these are the colors that are associated with the holiday of Christmas. perhaps through the originating from the holly leaves and berries. But now we see the ornaments, the Christmas tree, and so forth. It's always the red and green colors that are connected with that holiday. And so that's the cultural aspect of color psychology. It's very deeply ingrained in those of us who are raised in that culture. Some aspects of color psychology are also instinctive. For example, the color red. Color red signifies strong emotion, like it does in this case with the flame of desire, and the car itself is red, the backdrop is red, and so it's really playing up that association of passion and desire. You think about Valentine's Day and the red hearts and so forth. But it's also associated with danger and with harm. And in your readings, there is mention of the red effect. What they found is that the color red has an effect on our ability for rational thought. Very minor, very almost insignificant, but enough to cause some statistical effects. For example, when sports teams are playing against each other, if one team is wearing red, they tend to win more often because the presence of that color red influences their opponent's cognitive faculties. They tend to have diminished decision-making ability just ever so slightly. Also, if you've ever been to a Target store and you've come out having spent a lot more money than you intended to, you might be able to blame their branding because they have red signs everywhere. The walls are red, a lot of the labels are red, and that tends to diminish, again, our rational thinking ability, but in that case, our ability to delay gratification. We tend to make impulse buys a little bit more often. And this is all based on instinctive factors. Why that is, we could speculate. Red is the color of our blood, and so it would usually mean that there's an injury or a danger of injury, and so we kind of go into sort of a survival mode or fight or flight. So maybe that's a holdover of those instincts that affect us in ways that we're not really conscious of. There are a few other examples. For the most part, though, this color psychology is things that we've learned through our upbringing, like within our culture. This is used pretty effectively by media creators. There is actually a job of the colorist that works on film productions. Media creators will very purposely choose the colors that they use for whether it's graphic designs or the scenery in a film or the clothing that the characters are wearing. This infographic you see here is from the series Breaking Bad. And what whoever created this graphic has done is gone through the entire series and recorded the colors associated with each character in each episode and laid it out on timelines. So you see Walter White, who's the main character, his wife Skylar, Jesse Pinkman, who's sort of his partner in crime with making the crystal meth, and some of the other characters as well. If you look at these timelines and see how the colors line up with some of the events in the show, there's some definite connections, and this is very purposely done. Jesse Pinkman is the one that I like to use as my example because he's very volatile. He has an explosive temper and runs off at the mouth a lot. He's kind of young and impulsive. And so you see, as we might expect, a lot of warm colors, yellow, red, and so on. And you see early on there's a lot of that yellow and red, those warm colors. on his timeline, and then there's this very noticeable block of black, which is really stands out. What happens at that point, which is labeled 3, is that he is abducted by Tuco, and Tuco is a bad guy. He's a kind of a drug lord that's really a very dangerous person. So you can imagine that's pretty bad for Jesse, and at that point the color really drops out. Now maybe at that point he's, and I don't remember specifically, he might be locked in the trunk of a car or somewhere where there's just no light, but the colors associated with him at that point are dark or black. And please pardon the cat in the background. And so that signifies the action that's taking place on the scene. Another place I like to point out is down here at the end of season 2, where you have a big block of red, which you can imagine there's a lot of, I think at that point he's partying a lot, he's doing a lot of drugs, there's probably some more of his volatile attitude, and then the color just kind of drops out. It goes to sort of a gray-green. At that point, and this is going to be a spoiler alert, Jane, his girlfriend in the show, dies. And so kind of the color goes out of his life. And he's in a very bad place. And then at the beginning of season 3, where now you see it go from gray-green to black again, as a point where he's going into rehab. So he's kind of reaching a very low point, and it's all achromatic at that point. There's black and white and gray, but none of this color that we see associated with him normally. So this was all done very purposely to go right along with the action on the scene, on the screen. You see this quote by Vince Gilligan, the creator of the show. He says, "I want to do the color timing for each of these episodes where I sit with the colorists and make sure that the colors, each individual scene is just the way you want it." So this is a media creator who is taking painstaking detail in choosing the colors that go into his media. Let's take a look at how this would look in practice. And this is not from Breaking Bad, this is from the movie The Matrix. In The Matrix, and this is more spoilers if you haven't seen The Matrix, most of it takes place within a virtual world. It's a computer simulation. And while they're in this artificial world, everything looks very real, but there's something not quite right. And that thing, oftentimes, is the color. There is often a green cast to everything, as you see in this image of Morpheus. The backdrop has that green tint to it. Even his skin tone has a bit of a green tint to it in his clothing. So it makes it feel like something's not quite right. It's not quite what we'd expect in nature. And so it creates that unearthly feeling, even before it's revealed to us that this is not the real world. Well, eventually they escape from the Matrix. They go out into what is the real world of the movie, which is this post-apocalyptic landscape. But when they're in the safety of the city where the humans live that are fighting the machines, now we have these warm colors. Everything is natural. Everything is warm and healthy and vital appearing. And so the skin tones are natural. They're warm. They're alive. And so you see a very distinct color change. But there's a third setting where when they leave the safety of their city and go out into the post-apocalyptic landscape, it all becomes very shifts from the warm colors to the cool colors. It becomes very gray and very blue and kind of cold and lifeless, with a lot of steel and cement and very drab clothing. So they make use of color in this way to really set the feel of the different environments and different situations they find themselves in. And here's one that I would have you kind of critique during class, since we're not having a live class right now. Take a look at this and think about how color is used. And consider the matrix example in looking at this and how those colors created a specific mood for the environment. This is an ad we can assume for a medication, and their tagline is "out of the hospital doesn't mean out of the woods." You have this older gentleman sitting in his home, and all around there's what appears to be a very healthy and living home. There's warm colors in the leather of the couch and even the carpet and the kitchen. The light has more of a warm quality to it, but all around him it's very pale blue, cold and lifeless looking color. Even the trees, of course, are dead and very kind of creepy looking, but this light coming, what looks like from his television, just creates a very unhealthy appearance around him, and so it goes right along with the theme of the ad, that his health is still in danger. It's really very clear use of color theory, or color psychology in that case. This week for your Photoshop practice, you're going to be working with manipulating color in a photograph. And as you play with those color manipulations, I really want you to think about how you might use those techniques to alter the emotional impression of an image, or just the energy of an image, by altering the color. Think about how you might create color associations by imbuing more red into an image, for example, or how you might build more energy by more or less energy by increasing or decreasing the color contrast with analogous or complementary colors. And we'll be taking these ideas into the next analysis assignment as well, and critiquing a media example for their use of color. If you do have any questions, again, don't hesitate to get in touch. And we will be moving into our Week 2 analysis as the next major assignment. And I look forward to seeing what everyone comes up with in their observations for that activity.